2 years after the lockdown, and things are starting to get serious with regards to inflation. The Bank of England announced the other day that they expect inflation to be 11% by the end of this summer. I would just say to that, in their dreams, it will be a lot higher than that for the reasons that I'm going to explain today. And what I'm going to try and do today is add a bit of value by telling you, teaching you what actually causes inflation. And as a spoiler, it's not what the BBC tell you, which is Keynesian twaddle about, I don't know, Brexit, you know, somehow causing wage inflation and a wage price spiral, or it's all Putin's fault, which is nonsense given that the UK imports less than 5% of its natural gas from Russia, and the Ukraine produces less than 10% of the world's wheat. So it's important to note as well that this is nothing to do with the benefit of hindsight here, you know, this video about inflation, because you were warned repeatedly about it 2 years ago. I told you 2 years ago that this insane combination of lockdowns which crush aggregate supply, combined with reckless money printing to finance things like furlough, was only going to end in one way, and that way was inflation. So what I'm going to do now is to explain to you the Austrian School view on what causes inflation, because I think it's extremely pertinent to the type of inflation that we're experiencing now. The Austrian School's explanation of inflation revolves around an identity, something that's true by definition, and that is that total expenditure in the economy must be equal to total receipts. So what I mean by that is, if I was to go and spend £10, that £10 would go into a shopkeeper's till. So my total expenditure, £10, would equal the retailer's receipts, £10. The Austrian School has a very easy way of calculating total expenditure, and that is to multiply the total amount of money in circulation, that's called the money supply, by how quickly or how often it's spent, and they call that velocity. So to just explain that with some simple numbers, if you imagine an economy with a money supply of £2 trillion, and that money supply was spent twice in a year, so velocity was 2, that would create total expenditure of £4 trillion a year. So if you use a few letters, you know, if M stands for money supply and V stands for velocity of circulation, M times V, MV in maths, would be equal to total expenditure. This is the river in Pori, by the way. It's quite nice. So if you remember, total expenditure must equal total receipts. So the next thing to do is to calculate total receipts. How would we do that? Well, very simply by multiplying the average price level across the whole economy, so we'll call that P, by the number of transactions. So that would be the total quantity of goods and services produced and sold across the whole economy in a year. So thinking about what we said before, that £4 trillion worth of expenditure will create receipts of £4 trillion, which will be made up via a combination of the quantity that's been sold at the average price level the stuff was sold at. You know, in a sense, what you can think about is that total receipts is basically like total revenue in accounting, price times quantity sold, price times sales volume, in other words. So one more time, the important thing to bear in mind here is that total expenditure, M times V, must by definition equal total receipts, P times T. So what's spent must go into somebody's till, by definition. So the Austrian School, they believe that there's 3 possible causes of inflation, and I'm going to run through each of those causes now and back it up with some numbers. So the first thing that can cause inflation is an increase in the money supply. So let's imagine that the money supply grows by 5% because the central bank's been printing money to finance government spending, like furlough or something. It's actually a lot more than 5%, but let's be prudent and say they've printed 5%. Even if velocity stays the same, that will result in a 5% increase in total expenditure. If expenditure goes up by 5%, then receipts have to rise by 5% too. Now, imagine if the economy isn't growing and T is 0, then the only way that total receipts can rise by 5% is if the price level P rises by 5%, and that's your 5% inflation. Yeah, so one more time. An increase in the money supply of 5% will increase total expenditure by 5%, other things being equal. That will increase receipts by 5%. If transactions are stable, that must, by definition, result in inflation of 5%. The second cause of inflation is an increase in the velocity of circulation of the money supply. So if the same amount of money is spent more rapidly, total expenditure will rise. So putting some numbers on, if fee is increasing by 5%, then other things being equal, total expenditure will rise by 5%. And in an economy that's not growing, where T is stable, that will result in 5% inflation, because that 5% increase in velocity has caused a 5% increase in total expenditure. If total expenditure has risen by 5%, total receipts must, by definition, rise by the same amount, 5%. And in an economy where the number of transactions is stable, that must result in a 5% increase in the price level, i.e. 5% inflation. So the final cause of inflation, according to the Austrian School, is a recession. Let's imagine that the economy's output falls by 5%, so there's 5% fewer goods and services being produced and sold. So even if total expenditure is constant, this will result in inflation of 5%, because the same total amount of expenditure is being spent on 5% fewer goods and services. So one more time, even if the money supply is constant, even if velocity isn't increasing, it is still possible to have inflation if there's a recession and there's fewer goods and services being bought and sold, because the same total amount of expenditure is going to fall on a smaller quantity of goods and services. So far in my analysis, I've just looked at changing one variable in the equation at a time. Now in the real world, it's possible for the money supply, the velocity of circulation and the number of transactions to all be changing at the same time. And in fact, this is exactly what is happening now. And this is why people like me were so worried about inflation. We could see what was coming 2 years ago. The Bank of England printed money so that the government could finance insane schemes like furlough and help out to eat out and other such nonsense. So we knew that the money supply was going to rise, and that was going to cause inflation on its own. The precedent for this, of course, was set back in 2008 when the commercial banks failed, and the government asked the Bank of England to print the money needed to bail the banks out. Now back then, it didn't result in massive consumer price inflation, and that was because the banks used the printed money that they got from the government to buy government bonds. And they did that because they expected the price of government bonds to keep on rising, because they expected the government to keep on buying more and more UK government debt. So it became almost like a no-win Ponzi scheme. But the good news was, at least that money didn't enter the real economy. The banks weren't lending it out to households. So the extra money created increased the money supply, but back in 2008 it didn't materially increase expenditure because the extra currency went straight into the bond market. rather than circulating around the real economy. This time around in 2020, when the Bank of England printed, the money did begin to circulate around the economy because it was given directly to households rather than to banks, and the households actually spent the money, you know, the furlough and the help out to eat out and the bounce back loans. All of that money entered the economy. It increased expenditure, receipts rose, and a lot of that rise in receipts has been inflation. Now at the moment velocity is still relatively low, because there's still a lot of morons out there who believe the BBC, that they believe all of these Keynesian models, that inflation's only going to be temporary. And for people like me, that's still extremely useful at the moment, because it allows me to spend the cash that I've got whilst it still has some purchasing power. In a not too distant future, I expect Joe Public to wake up and smell the coffee and realise that central banks have given up on inflation. Cash is a poor store of value. So in that circumstance, the logical thing for even the dumbest of the dumb to do is to realise that they need to spend their money quickly to maximise its purchasing power. And once that happens, velocity increases. So even if at that point the Bank of England stops printing new currency, it won't be enough to stop a massive increase in expenditure. So the same amount of money spent more rapidly will create an increase in total expenditure. That will create an increase in receipts. And we're also seeing, sadly, the number of transactions, the economy's output falling rapidly. So we're going to get a lot more inflation, and the key to it is the velocity. And it's not inconceivable that the UK could enter into a classic hyperinflationary feedback loop, where velocity increases, that increases expenditure at a time when the economy is really struggling. We're in a massive recession, output's falling. So that increase in expenditure is only going to do one thing, and that's bid up the price level. So inflation rises again. So that's going to affect even more consumers, even people who are like properly thick, are going to realise like something's wrong here. Inflation's rising. It changes consumer psychology, and as velocity increases, that leads to increases in expenditure, more inflation. That raises inflationary expectations yet again, which causes a further increase in velocity, and so on. And this is the classic hyperinflationary doom loop. So that's the end of this video. I hope you've managed to understand the Austrian School explanation on what causes inflation. And personally, what I would do now is to think about converting your cash into stores of value that can't be printed. Because even if the Bank of England stops printing money now, I believe that there's already been enough currency created to cause a hyperinflation. And all that's needed to light this dry tinder is just a recognition on the part of the general public that central banks have lost control, and they're no longer interested in trying to control inflation. But if you still believe that inflation, worldwide global inflation, is due to Brexit and a wage price spiral in Britain, you're on drugs. In summary, you know what's happened. The Austrian School view explains what's causing this inflation. You've had common policies across the board, across many countries, of money printing to finance bribes in the form of furlough lockdowns. You've had a crushing of output through the lockdowns. A load of companies have gone bust. That on its own will cause inflation, because the same amount of expenditure is buying up fewer goods, so that forces the price level up. And then you've also got the last one, which is velocity. So, you know, as I say, there's probably already enough currency being issued to cause a hyperinflationary collapse. All that's needed now to light this dry tinder, as I say, is a recognition on the part of the general public that the central banks are not going to raise interest rates above inflation to slow velocity. They're basically trying to introduce central bank currencies, and to do that they need to hyperinflate away the existing currencies that we've got, and this is the story, you know. So we're going to actually get a hyperinflationary depression, and the depression aspect of it, you know, collapsing output, is just going to cause even higher price rises. So yeah, that's all that I want to say really, is good luck. Spend the cash that you've got now before it's got, whilst it still has purchasing power. That would be my advice. And you know, educate yourself. Don't just trust me. Just read up on some Austrian economics. You know, they would say that a lot of people say, well, it's just monetarism. Well, it's not actually, because what the Austrian school recognise is that velocity is extremely unstable, and changes in velocity on its own have got enough potential to cause inflationary havoc.